So we're back into the propertarianism here on the Jockle podcast. And the reason why is because GLV put out an article. You guys know I've read some GLV before. GLV, I think, is like an Albanian name or something. But I've read some GLV before. And he put out the first two parts of a 3-part series on propertarianism. I read the first part, and the first part was not substantive. The first part simply had to do with the personality of Kurt Doolittle, the rumors surrounding Kurt Doolittle, the drama surrounding Kurt Doolittle. So it wasn't really a substantive article. It was more of a sort of a journalistic documenting the social sphere around him. And I took away, not the best impression. I didn't think it was GLV's best work. And I thought that this was going to morph into more of the same. I thought it was going to, all right, so if you say something like, you may consume 3 beans but no more, I don't know what that means, but we'll have to figure that out later. All right, so if you start making these defenses, like there was no mention whatsoever of his background in intelligence work and how that might bias him. There was also little, the most significant thing to me about Kurt is his perspective on Ukraine, which is interesting because the publisher of GLV is a pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian website, which is interesting because, most of these white nationalist alt-right types, they are pro-Russia and to a degree anti-Ukraine. And he provides a counterbalance, or the publisher provides a counterbalance, which is interesting. And actually, all three parts are out. So it sounds what GLV did here is GLV he made a soft, I don't know what you would call it, sort of an inviting, friendly foray into propertarianism, not as an idea, but saying, oh, Kurt is fine, and everything is fine here, and everything is good. And he sort of invited you in, and he lulled you into a false sense of security. And then he starts breaking things down. Now, I haven't read the full article, but I've read the introduction, and we might do part 2 and part 3, because I just noticed part 3 is up. But I at least wanted to sort of do a take-by-take. We're reading this article for the first time. We're breaking it down. I'm going to ignore the first part because you can go back and forth on the character of someone endlessly. We can speculate endlessly. And I was even going to bring up the Ukrainian dimension of, if you look at Goebbels and Stens and Ernst Röhm and the left wing of the National Socialists, how they were more pro-Russia, how Hitler had a cousin in England and America, and how he had visited the Anglosphere, and how he was just dogmatically pro-England. And there was that split within the party, and Hitler ultimately won that split, and it was really an aristocrat. It was really a class warfare split at the end of the day, even though Hitler came from somewhat, he was homeless at a point. He did come from middle-class origins, and he did respect the Prussian aristocracy to an extent, people like Frederick the Great. So, there are all these elements that I could go into specifically about the Ukraine-Russian dialectic there and how that relates to Kurt and his involvement in the State Department, how that relates to the publisher of GLV, and so on and so forth. So we could get into that, but really what might be most productive is just to read the article and dive into the ideas that are more relevant here rather than that history, which might be for another time or tacked on to the end of the video. Let's begin with part 2 of the article. We've brushed past the personal parts, and we're into Whiggery versus Abrahamism. Now, when we say Whiggery, we're, of course, speaking about the Whigs. So we want to make that clear that the Whigs were a political party, a political movement, a political force in England. And the Whigs had a progressive, teleological view of history, that everything's going to be better in the future. So that's who the Whigs are. So when we talk about Whiggery, we're talking about the Whigs. And then we're also talking about Abrahamism. So rather than even define what that is, we might just go straight into the article. First of all, let's say that there's been no systematic exposition of proprietarian philosophy either from Kurt Doolittle or John Mark. There's no book to read and precious few online resources to peruse. And so we're left with trying to discover the philosophy from Kurt's many Facebook updates and online interviews, or, as I read, his comment discussions with people like Ivan the Heathen below YouTube videos. This paucity of information has already been criticized by the distributist and intrepid YouTuber who has few kind words to say about Kurt Doolittle or proprietarianism. Thus, I'll base my critique on what I've learned directly through my personal interactions with Doolittle on Facebook and what little information there is on the website. One of the first things that jumps out at us about proprietarianism is it is decisively Whiggish. It's descended from the Whig view of history. It sees history as a list of wrongs being gradually rectified by science and knowledge. So when we think about liberalism, the extreme left, typically they have an extreme Whig view of history that everything that happened in the past is a degree of evil. The further back you go, the greater the evil, the more recent, the lesser the evil, until the present day, in which we have the least amount of evil, and the future has even less evil. So you see, it's a very teleological, it equates chronology with ethics and morality, essentially, in a very deterministic Newtonian clockwork fashion. It recognizes the character of European man as described by, and this is specifically Kurt's Whiggish view of history, recognizes the character of European man as described by Riccardo Ducenza in The Uniqueness of Western Civilization. It splits the intellectual heritage of modernity into Western, good, and that which is external to the West, usually Semitic, bad. Doolittle is particularly fond of denouncing Abrahamism, with the ridiculous contention that Christianity is Semitic and that thus exogenous to Europe. This is manifestly false to anyone with even the slightest knowledge of Christian and Jewish conceptions of the world, and specifically man's place in it, how it relates to natural law. Indeed, what differentiated Christianity from Islam, got Jesus crucified, and inspired Saul of Tarsus to become St. Paul, was the fact that logocentric Christian forthrightness cut through the proto-Talmudic mental gymnastics of the Pharisees, who were attempting to violate the spirit of the law by twisting its letter to mean the opposite. So that's something we can contend, that's something we can argue with or take issue with. I mean, my position is not a black and white position. It's not that Christianity is inherently anti-Semitic or that it is purely logocentric. That's not my position. My position is that clearly there is a distinction between Christianity and Judaism. They are not the same thing. But at the same time, we can't completely divest Christianity from its Jewish origins. So it's an unsatisfying gray answer where you can't go to one extreme or the other, and you have to understand there are different strands and sects and variations and manifestations of Christianity throughout history, and even the present day. It's developing in different directions. The way people take cultural Christianity, for example, the way it's we can talk about a Germanic Christianity. We can talk about how Christianity is often intertwined both by the extreme left and the extreme right with whiteness, just due to basic historical reasons. But then there might be an interplay between history and ideology, where Christianity really has become, whatever its origins were, it has become a certain way. It has become associated with certain forms of culture that are indigenous to Europe. So, I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms. In the same way that we could talk about, Countercurrents is pro-Ukraine, Kurt Doolittle is pro-Ukraine, the State Department is pro-Ukraine and anti-Russian. So there is an Anglosphere bias here, as opposed to the, you might say, more continental bias, which tends to be more pro-Russia and anti-Anglosphere. We could get into all of that, but I just want to digest the entire article first. Doolittle flippantly claims that Abrahamic faiths invented and industrialized lying. That phrase itself is interesting, because when we talk about generative anthropology, we're talking about the origins of language, signs and signifiers, mythology. And this concept of lying, or this concept of deception, and then the concept of metaphor often become confused. Like when you ask Kurt, like, okay, what would be considered lying? And he's like, well, Judaism would be considered lying. So if anyone practices Judaism or advocates for Judaism or for Christianity or any other religion, Islam, then they are embarking on an industrial scale lie. But a lot of the claims of religion and spirituality can't be falsified or unfalsified, and often they are metaphorical, and often they are ethical and moral in their basis. Really, their purpose is not to describe history, but their purpose is to spin narratives and to tell narratives and paint pictures that impel people and create archetypes that impel people to certain action and to certain code of conduct and certain behavior. And there's a difference between deception, which is, clearly there is a form of fraud, and Kurt Doolittle will interchangeably use the words fraud and lie and deception and obfuscation, and he'll sort of interchangeably use these words, but obviously they're different, right? So if I want to defraud you, I'm going to steal money from you, I might tell you I have some gold, and really it's fool's gold. So that's a deliberate lie, deliberate deception in order for me to gain wealth at your expense. So they're very clear instances of fraud in the world. But if I tell a little child and I tell them, well, Santa is real and Santa's going to give you presents if you act good, I mean, would then Kurt Doolittle say, well, you're trying to defraud the child of the child's ability to be selfish and egoistic? You're trying to steal resources from them and collect like dividends of good behavior by using this lie of Santa. And that almost, to me, invalidates the idea that there are like collectives like families or even nations, right? We've had that debate many times on this channel, the role of nations and nationalism. But the idea that collectives or groups exist at all, and that within these groups there might need to be reorganization of executive decision making. There might have to be a reorganization of the executive function is what I was going for. So people might not know what's best, and they might have to, a certain scaffolding or structure might have to be set up linguistically to guide their behavior in the right direction in the absence of a Platonic watchman. That Plato has this idea that a perfect republic would have a watchman like standing beside me and coaching me on what to do at all times. So I would never be lazy, I would never be lustful, I would never be gluttonous, I would never do all these things, because the moment I started to think of it that way or started to act that way, the watchman would give me a little slap on the cheek and set me in the right direction. But of course, society is not like that, right? So we don't have enough angels to go around, and even the people who are on the top are not angels. So you have to have these narratives that are capable. The other tale of Plato being the myth of the metals, the idea that there are different kinds of people, and different kinds of people give rise to different kinds of people, and so there's this experimentation where Plato admits, like, hey, this is not an attempt to defraud society. I wonder maybe Doolittle rejects Platonism entirely, but I wonder what he would think specifically about the myth of the metals, like in a ethical sense. Like, do you think it is ethical or unethical to sell people Santa Claus or to sell people a myth of the metals in an attempt to get good behavior out of them? And the other part of generative anthropology is the idea that he would say, no, you never lie to people, you always tell the truth, and the truth sets you free and it sets you on the good path. And it's like, well, how do we get to a point where we have science and rationality? We got to it through sociality, through animalism. We were animals before we were humans. And so there's a scaffolding below our rationality that is this pre-rational, instinctual sociality and reproduction and sexuality, and all of these things underlie our rationality. and they build up and build up, and they build up more complex structures over time, and finally we're able to be conscious and rational, and we're able to use our consciousness and rationality to govern these lower building blocks and to set them aside and reorganize them to an extent. But if you want to completely destroy the undergirding building blocks and all you have is rationality, then you have no will to live and no will to survive. And so you're not dealing with pragmatic matters, you're no longer dealing with what is necessary, and you're dealing with that which is theoretical and abstract and rational. And at that point, that you open yourself up to possibly spending your time rationally doing mathematical equations which have no bearing on the real world. And that is the problem, I guess, when you totally discount the pre-rational. Which is it true or is it false to want to live? Well, it's not an is statement, it's not a descriptive statement, it's a prescriptive statement. You can't derive it from rationality. It precedes rationality. So that is something that we can investigate through generative anthropology. It's something that this question of what is a deception, what is a lie, what is a fraud, what is religion, what is language. These are really important questions that Kurt doesn't really get into. He just has a very black and white view of the world, which I don't think is very sophisticated. I guess it's sophisticated in the sense that he has expounded upon this black and white view, but he's starting from a very bad axiomatic view of the world where everything is black and white. It's like, well, if that's what you're starting with, you're probably going to end up with some pretty ridiculous stuff. Let's continue. He says, specifically, in replacing explanatory pagan faiths with authoritarian mystical faiths promising utopia after death. I mean, what is Valhalla? What are the Elysian fields? What is reincarnation? Okay, so replacing explanatory pagan faiths with mystical faiths promising utopia, I don't think you can create that dichotomy. I don't think you've studied ancient religion or pre-Christian religion if you make that kind of statement. Now, certainly Christianity simplifies reincarnation. Rather than being infinite reincarnations, it says, this is your one life, you die, you go to heaven or hell. So it simplifies the model. Whereas ancient reincarnation would say, well, for a period of generations, eventually you can go from being a beggar to a king and back again. So it's a more gradual process, it's a more differentiated, infinite process as opposed to a finite bifurcation between heaven and hell. But the principle there is the same. And that is found in Hinduism, that's found in Norse paganism, and that's found in Greco-Roman paganism. So I don't know. I don't know where this, even when we go into like prehistory and we theorize about what religion would be like, most of the evidence I've seen points to ancestor worship. And that implies a kind of reincarnation. When people look up at the stars and they say, oh, well, that's our great ancestor living over there, up in the stars there. Well, that sort of implies that there is a form of reincarnation, that there is a heavenly realm, there is a utopia, there is a divine cosmos, a world order. Yeah, I think... So GLV agrees. He says that pagan religions don't promise rewards and punishment in the afterlife is news to me, as is the claim that systematic storytelling, which is nothing but eusocial deception, eusocial meaning for the benefit of sociality, is somehow unique to Abrahamic faiths or exogenous to Europe. This is leaving aside the clear fact that Christianity as it was and still is practiced in the West is a European faith. Anyone who thinks that European Christians do not still venerate Odin should look very closely at the celebration of St. Nicholas, or thinks that we've forgotten Hercules should consider St. George. Genetics trumps memetics always and inexorably. I don't know if I totally agree with all that, but we're just reading GLV. Christianity practiced by Africans has more in common with Islam practiced by Africans than with Christianity practiced by Europeans. Similarly, living in the Balkans, I have the privilege of interacting with Muslims whose genetics aren't so dissimilar from my own, yet we cannot be lumped together in the same racial subgroup. They go to mosque like I go to church, just as my pagan friends salute the sun and my Thelmite friends do their weird Freemasonry but with titties thing. We all... You hang out with some weird people, GLV. Okay. We all do it to signal belonging in the Schmittian political sense and to engage in aesthetic transcendence, psychodrama. This is not to say that there are no noticeable differences between the various faiths, especially as regard their ability to build civilizations, but all faiths practiced by Europeans take on a European character. We cannot escape the basic biological fact of our neural architecture, which is fundamentally different from that of other peoples. You know, I don't think that argument accepts the bell curve. The bell curve states that populations are not black and white distinct categories as sometimes called natural kinds. Like I might say that an electron is a natural kind and a proton is a natural kind, and that these are like distinct categories that can't be confused, although there might be some underlying architecture and quarks or string theory that somehow unites the two. You know, I don't know specifically, but for the purposes of my knowledge of physics, I would say, okay, those are two natural kinds because they're distinguishable and they don't overlap. To call white people a natural kind and black people a natural kind and say there's no overlap, there's clear overlap. There's clear overlap in every dimension. I mean, there's overlap in skin color. There are albino black people. There's overlap in intelligence. There's overlap in propensity to violence. There's overlap in every single category. There is no area. I mean, even sickle cell anemia, like you can get into very detailed, you know, diseases and medical conditions where, you know, it's 99% of cases are black Africans and less than 1% of cases are white Europeans, but there's still recorded cases of non-Africans, or just the fact that there is racial mixing between people makes it's like you can't have an electron and a proton breed together and form a mulatto half electron, half proton. That's not possible because they are these distinct categories. They are black and white categories for the purpose of this discussion. So races are not distinct categories in this way. There is overlap. You do have groups of white. I mean, if I take a group of white drug addicts and I tell them to go build civilization, I wouldn't expect them to be capable of that. I mean, if you've really lived in these communities, you've really experienced these people, there are so many white people out there who are just totally hopeless, totally violent, there's no moral backbone to them. And then you can look at Christianized Africans with PhDs, the top 1% of Africa, and these people blow away the white working class. I mean, when they come to America, they blow away the white working class. So these are not distinct categories that you can say, whoa, there's this neural architecture and all that. I would disagree with all that. But let's skip over that for a moment and just continue. I agree with Doolittle that Judaism, especially Talmudic Judaism, is not a good faith. Well, what's your definition of morality here? How do you that would be a great thing to read. How do you ethically call the faith good or bad? Because if we're talking about evolutionary success, like Kevin McDonald says, it's a group evolutionary strategy. Why is it not a good faith? It seems to be very successful. So why is it not a good faith? Not conducive to the construction of great civilizations. However, I disagree. Okay, well, that might be if your morality is just, I want to construct great civilizations, then maybe you could make your case there. However, I disagree with Judaism's purported role as the progenitor of Christianity. Christianity was a large reaction to Judaic legalism. Jesus' ministry was a sword cutting through the Gordian knot of legalism once combined with European genetics. Christianity energized pagan Europe, and specifically German Europe. Rome was great but declined. German Faustian civilization was stratospheric. Even as it is dying, we stand in awe of the glory it was. It began to decline when its Christian faith was Judaized, first by Luther and Calvin and the Puritans, who hated that which was pagan, including Christmas, maypoles, cathedrals, liturgy, salvation through deeds or works, divine right of kings, and patriarchal marriage. So that's GLV's perspective, which, I think it's an interesting perspective because on the one hand he's saying that German Europe is great, But on the other hand, German Europe is what created Luther and Calvin and the Puritans. Southern Europe, Mediterranean Europe, did not have this Protestantism. It did not have this Puritanism or Calvinism or Lutheranism. It didn't have that. So why is that? I'd like to hear an explanation for that. Why do you think that is? Maybe it's the Faustian civilization defeating itself in a Nietzschean sense of the warrior turning in toward himself when he defeats his external enemies. But it's interesting what propertarianism would have to say about all this. I think Doolittle he's very much a Nordicist who is more friendly toward Protestantism than Catholicism, and he likes this cutting away of old things and simplifying and being pure. But maybe he would say that Catholicism is more traditional and that maybe there is some Abrahamism in Protestantism. I'm not sure exactly what his position would be. Propertarianism sees not only this history, but all good as coming from white Europeans, all bad coming from Semites. This is possibly the worst position on our current troubles one could conceivably take, short of actually being a supporter of Globo Homo. The fact of the matter is that all our troubles come from within, from the arrogance and Gnosticism of white people. If Semites are involved, they are mostly acting as opportunists, taking advantage of a sick civilization, Jews or no Jews, who are approaching winter due to our own sins, liberalism, altruism, utopian lust for heaven on earth, lust for empire, greed, and usury all came from white Europeans when Jews were still under the thumb of rabbis and shtetls. To be blind to our own complicity in our demise is to repeat the mistakes of the past. Yes, Jews have acted in bad faith. Yes, they've taken advantage of winter, and they've done so more proficiently than other non-whites. But let's not think that getting rid of anybody or getting rid of Abrahamism will fix what's wrong with the rest, if we can indeed fix what's wrong. So, Massachusetts Bay Propertarianism. Propertarians' best idea by far is extending the definition of property to include intangible commons. For example, interpersonal trust is something which is painstakingly built of self-evident value and worth protecting. Therefore, propertarians argue we should protect it as we would any other form of property. Since interpersonal trust cannot be individuated the way land and cattle are, it can only be considered common property. Who will defend the commons? How do we avoid the tragedy of these intangible commons, even as we suffer through the tragedies of tangible commons? Courts of law and torts. Doolittle proposes granting universal standing to citizens to protect the intangible commons from assault. Therefore, he who threatens social cohesion, interpersonal trust, the genetic integrity of the nation, and so on will be prosecuted, and the prosecutor will be remunerated for his service to the community in rooting out this assault on the commons. Of note is the innovation in torts which propertarianism proposes in order to make these intangible commons easier to defend, specifically making untruthful speech actionable, or rather speech where the speaker hasn't performed due diligence to make sure that what they were saying is truthful to the best of his ability. This will also extend to business dealings where any sort of informational asymmetry will be grounds for nullifying a transaction. Transactions which do not satisfy criteria for productivity will also be circumscribed, as will those that have externalities pertaining to the commons of others' property. It's like a weird communism in which you're like protecting individuals from being scammed. So like there's a communist or a Marxist concept that the capitalist exploits the worker by deceiving the worker and making, through all kinds of deceptions, making himself seem powerful, making himself seem useful, making himself seem necessary through religion, through culture, all sorts of things. So there's a Marxist argument that capitalists exploit people through deception and that you need communism to root out this deception. On the other hand, you have like a libertarian conception which says that that you need to, everything needs to be free and everything is property centric. So it's almost like a unification between the two, and you don't really know where it's going to go. You don't know if it's going to be anarcho-capitalism. You don't know if it's going to turn into full-fledged communism. You don't know, because once you actually empower people to start saying this is the truth, that this is not the truth, once you start putting people in that position, like in the same way that communism was supposed to be stateless, but then the Bolsheviks took hold of the ideology and they said, well, for a time we need a dictatorship of the proletariat. I could see, and I mean, Doolittle has suggested that you need some kind of Caesarism. You might need a dictatorship of the proletarians in order to usher in the proletarian age. Now, whether or not that age actually comes or not, or whether the power is solidified socially among this new hierarchy that then sort of pushes the ideology to the side, in the same way in the Soviet Union, you had all these people who were empowered by ideological Marxism, and then once they actually came to power, they sort of forgot about the original doctrines. They laid those to the side to a degree, they became cynical about them, and they just pursued their own power. This is the theory about the KGB with Vladimir Putin, that the KGB was ultimately a non-political or a non-ideological entity. It simply sought its own power, and ultimately it saw doctrinaire communism as a limitation on its power, a limitation on its ability to act within the Russian state, a limitation on the ability of the Russian state to act on the global world stage. And so there was a deliberate collusion with the West through people like, I'm trying to even remember, what was the last president, Soviet, the guy who was an alcoholic. Typically the conspiracy theory is that from Mikhail Gorbachev. So the Gorbachev was not the guy I'm talking about necessarily, but that there was some kind of conscious or intended or intentional act to degrade the power of communism so that the KGB could emerge as a more successful entity within Russia, and not only within Russia, but Russia on the global stage. And I'm going to start reading about Gorbachev here if we're not careful. I'm just trying to figure out Yeltsin. I didn't even read his name, but sometimes you just talk for long enough and the memories, they bubble up. You shake in the water and the oil and it bubbles up to the top. We got Yeltsin. Yeltsin's who I was talking about. All right, so yeah, there's that problem where you start off like ideologically pure, and then you justify a dictatorship of proletarians, and then your dictatorship comes into power, and then it's like, okay, well, it's time to let go of power and allow true proletarianism to work now, and then they're like, maybe in 100 years. And then you actually never get your perfect utopian ideology, and you just are stuck with this dictatorship, as has happened many times in history. In effect, proletarian law will empower the community to root out lies, informational asymmetry, mimetic warfare against intangible commons, and unproductive or asymmetrical business transactions. It would create a moral busybody's wet dream. This will ironically endanger one piece of intangible property almost everyone can agree exists and must be defended with the full force of the law: privacy. To make sure nobody is engaged in nefarious activity against the commons, an interpersonal surveillance state must be established, and people will have to self-police for speculative speech so that they won't inadvertently speak an untruth as per the testimonial standard of truth. Indeed, a search for privacy on Proletarian Institute's website reveals no relevant articles. It is strange that a system of law concerned with protecting intangibles, which soak up investment and are worth defending, would ignore this glaringly obvious example, which is quite visibly under attack in the modern world. So, I want to continue reading, but I also want to stop there and talk about this issue of privacy and the issue of lying. I think it's interesting from an ethical standpoint when we ask ourselves, what should we do, right? So there's a warrior ethos which tells people you have to fix the world, you have to defeat the demons of the world, you have to slay the dragons, and therefore we need to come up with a plan of action to elect Donald Trump, or we need to come up with a plan of action to start a civil war, we need to come up with a plan of action to do this or that. And people have all these plans of actions, and that is a warrior ethos, and at some point that comes into contradiction with a priestly ethos which says, well, all of that's really futile and irrelevant and doesn't really matter. So at that point, when you're working within the priestly ethos, you have to ask yourself, what is worth it? What should be done? In this life we're living, right? What should be done? We have the choice to make moral actions and immoral actions. What is morality? And one of the first things I think that we can conceive of, which Doolittle does conceive of, but has been conceived of before, is the idea of being perfectly honest, telling the truth, and only telling the truth. And that's pretty hard, because in order to be in business, to be social, you have to constantly tell lies. Sociality is a constant game of deception. You're always dressing yourself up, playing yourself up to look better than you are. You don't just roll out of bed in the morning and go to, I mean, some people do, right? So, drug addicts, hippies, whatever. Some people actually do that. And maybe there's something enviable about that. Maybe there's something moral and honest about that. But most people don't roll out of bed, especially women. You have to think about the role of women in society. The level of deception, makeup is a form of deception, right? And this is something that most women wear. Most women wear makeup, and so most women are engaging in an active form of deception in order to defraud the commons, you might say. Would Kurt Doolittle ban makeup? It's an interesting question, but we have to consider the fact that sociality and deception are really intertwined. And that's very pragmatic, right? We understand the pragmatism of this form of deception, and we accept it when we engage in sociality. Otherwise, if you're totally autistic, that's going to bump up against your ability to be social, right? If you constantly are criticized, oh, sports ball is just people throwing around balls and it's so stupid, and makeup is so stupid, and dancing is stupid, it's like simulated sex and it's so vulgar, and like, this is what autistic people do, and they're not very sociable, and as a result of not being sociable, they are not very powerful, they're not very influential, because most power is social power. Insider trading ultimately has to do with the social connections that you have, and the richest people in the world are rich through a form of insider trading or legal manipulations or something that is essentially social and is not individuated. Engineers are not the richest people in the world. Inventors are not the richest people in the world. These people are pawns of those who are more social. The CEO. The CEO is not a man who is the best man in the company, but he's the man who seems as if he is the best man in the company. So there's a distinction between seeming and being, and there is a confusion between power and morality. In a sense, Kurt Doolittle is an extremely Puritan, moral man, because he places this emphasis on truth-telling and honesty and autism, as opposed to actually pragmatic sociality and deception and metaphor and these sort of things that actually gain power. And this is a systematic problem with autistic people, is that they think they're on the path to power. They think that through all of this autism that they are on the way to taking over the world. They have these delusions of grandeur. But in fact, what they don't realize is that joining the system of deception is the easiest way to gain power. And ignoring that is the easiest way to make yourself irrelevant. But, there's it's on all sides. People are on all sides engaging in this. It's not to say that autism is totally a function of the right. I mean, there are people on the left who are just as autistic about gender pronouns and all these sorts of things. But let's just get back to the article for a second. It's strange that the system of law would be this way. Maybe it's a feature rather than a bug. After all, Kurt makes a big deal of having completed the scientific method. The scientific method is a very bad way of learning things under conditions of imperfect or limited information. Privacy is a gigantic impediment to the free flow of information for a society which subjects every truth claim to a scientific testimonial validity test. Imagine a proprietarian Facebook would quite confidently declare your personal information its own private property, to be defended even to the point of suing you for fun and profit if you attempted to protect yourself. What do you have to hide, Abrahamist? Hiding is a precursor to speaking untruth or not performing due diligence, which is to say informing the community of all the possible and foreseeable consequences of your speech and actions. Not saying the whole truth as per a witness's oath is an actionable offense under proprietarian law. Privacy and the right to remain silent which is a right to keep your thoughts private, are impossible under such a system. Tellingly, Kurt Doolittle is skeptical of black swans or unforeseeable events which bring about great change, as befits someone who believes that the world can be completely understood by empirical means. A proprietarian system will compel you to speak the truth and nothing but the truth all the time. So yeah, it precludes sociality. It is an anti-social system. It is an autistic system. But I want to look at the positive side of that, because if Kurt stopped fooling himself into thinking he was a warrior who was going to take over the world and change the world and everything like that, but he understood himself as a priestly figure, a figure who he just wants to stop the lies. And if you think about it, if you examine your own private life and you ask yourself, what am I not willing to display to the world, and what are my motivations here? I mean, you're going to find that you do tell lies. You're going to find that you do deceive. You're going to find that you do hide the ugly parts of yourself that you don't want people to see, and you're afraid of people seeing that. I mean, imagine, there's that Jim Carrey movie, Liar, Liar, where he has to tell the truth all the time. But imagine something even more extreme. Imagine that your entire, not just your life, but your thoughts, all of your thoughts were just broadcast to the world, and you were not able to maintain a filter. Just whatever you thought at all times was just totally broadcast. The good thoughts, the bad thoughts, the in-between, all of your doubts, all your insecurities, all of your anger, all of your sadness, every negativity, and all of your schadenfreude, all of your happiness at the pain of other people and the suffering of other people. All of the thoughts you have, if you start cataloging your own thoughts and examining them with an objective eye and an eye of what would other people think, a third-person perspective, you're going to see that it would be catastrophic for your sociality. It would be catastrophic for your ability to function as a social animal in the world, in communities, in collectives of people, to just have all of your thoughts broadcast all the time. It would make you a very irritable person to be around. It would make you an ugly person to be around. It would make you would be a pariah. You would be an outcast. So it's an interesting question. Is, once you get to that point, then you can start asking yourself, well, how could I change the way I think so that I could be an open book? Is it possible to be an open book? And in a way, I think this is sort of the function of the priestly mindset. And the priestly path is you want to start deconstructing your own thoughts, like the Buddhists or the monastic life, where you let go of your own ego and you allow these thoughts to come into your mind and to pass away, and you don't become attached to them. And then at some point, all of the egoism and all of the meanness and all of the sadness and the anger and the lust and the schadenfreude and all these feelings we have that we have to hide from people because we want to hide our true motivations, and these are motivations which help us compete in the social sphere. But if we let go of all these emotions, then we really could theoretically become a person who is capable of telling the truth at all times and not being a pariah in all senses of the word. Of course, you're a pariah in the sense that you're outside of society, the priestly caste, the ascetic caste being the one who lives in the mountain or lives in the forest or lives in the church, right? You're outside of society in a way because you're not social in that sense. You're not competing in the social sphere. You're not a reproductive agent. You're not a sexual agent, but you do become an honest agent. You become a man who someone can talk to, and you can just tell the truth, and there's nothing to hide there. So in a sense, there is this priestly aspect. I don't want to completely trash Doolittle, but I want to say that there is, like, underneath all of his twists and turns and his misrepresentations and confusions or whatever, this obsession with the truth and the obsession with honesty is an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing when you deconstruct your life, when you get to a point where you're sort of in a season of life where you detach yourself from external goals and you stop trying to save the world and you stop trying to become a millionaire. You become disinterested with progress. You become disinterested with the Whig theory of history and science and technology. You become disinterested with all of this, and you ask yourself, well, what can I do with this life? I'm not dead, so what do I do with this life? Well, it does seem to be a noble goal or an admirable goal or a challenging goal to ask yourself, could I become totally honest? Could I become completely honest? And what would I have to do in order to become completely honest? I would have to let go of my ego. Right, so there's this harmonization where you have evil thoughts or you have harmful thoughts or sadistic thoughts, And then you have this concept of honesty. In order for the two to meet in your personality, or to be harmonized in your personality, you have to let go of your egoism, and you have to start thinking altruistically and selflessly. And that's sort of the Buddhist and the Christian path, which they pursue a little bit differently. There's not as much altruism in the Buddhist path as there is in the Christian path, but there's a lot of similarities there, that you go down that route and you let go of the negative and you embrace the positive in a selfless way. And at that point, you really can be completely honest. You really can be transparent. You really could have someone think of all your, or have all your thoughts be on blast, and have your private life examined, and there would be nothing. You would just be living simply. You would be living in accordance and harmony with your surroundings, and there would be nothing to hide. So, I mean, it's interesting that Doolittle decries mysticism, and yet if you take this axiom of truthfulness to the logical extent, you do arrive at some form of mysticism, some Buddhism or Christianity or something. Back to the article. Proprietarians might counter that there's no stipulation for compelling speech, but this is a hidden fragility in the system which will become apparent in the event of a proprietarian purity spiral. All movements eventually have purity spirals, which can only be halted by the rulers taking decisive action against its perpetrators. This cannot be done if the law restricts the rulers, does not allow them to use the big stick of repressive power with some degree of arbitrariness. That means allowing the rulers, and under reciprocity everyone else, to make judgment calls in situations where there is incomplete information, thus rendering such decisions incompatible with the completion of the scientific method. In the event of incomplete information, the scientific method stipulates taking a neutral position, but in real life not acting because you don't know everything is suicide. Contrary to the predictions that we will permanently defeat the left, we can expect that in a proprietarian society, the church lady type woman who are currently busy rooting out political correctness wherever it may hide, and who in Puritan New England were busy rooting out sin wherever it was hiding, will find themselves busy rooting out Abrahamism, mysticism, informational asymmetry, and inadequately performed due diligence. John Mark will try to sell you on proprietarianism by promising you the opportunity to sue leftists for fun and profit, but human psychology doesn't really work like that. The rightist mind fundamentally simply wants to be left alone to work, live, have children, tending a garden quietly, and privately praising his God. Leftism is a hack of the human social status module. It allows otherwise weak and useless people to rise in status without deserving it by signaling holiness against a foil, a rightist. It is the leftist who busies himself with what others think, feel, and believe, and who uses gossip, rallying, shaming, and moralizing to undermine his social betters, something that Kurt despises when he witnesses it in modern populations, but which will inevitably arise under a proprietarian system. He likes to imagine proprietarianism as a shining Indo-European city on a hill, but it's likelier to look like an actual historical shining city on a hill, the petty totalitarian nightmare that was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, is that true? Was the Massachusetts Bay Colony a terrible place, or was it a crucible of a new civilization, an American civilization? That is a debate in itself. I mean, certainly we can see the negative aspects here, but it's funny, in arguing against this, GLV is making me sympathetic. I'm like, yeah, that in a sense there is virtue in that, in a society of truth-telling, in a Puritan society, a society which was very fertile, a society which really did give birth to America in a lot of ways. So in arguing against Kurt, I mean, GLV actually provides, I think, a very strong argument in favor of Kurt to Kurt's benefit, which is interesting. The key reason for this, of course, is Doolittle's personal history. We can scarcely expect an old stock Connecticut Yankee to understand that his ancestors were evil men who undermined the greatness of the West for their own personal lust for power, and that their Puritan fantasies of a city free of sin led to an entire country built entirely on that mother of all sins, pride. So, yeah, I guess the argument there is that this Puritanism has ultimately led to this fanatical liberalism that is undermining the West, and so on and so forth. Cracking heads, proprietarianism versus fascism. Proprietarianism's biggest promise is the suppression of parasitism. The Proprietarian Institute identifies several forms of parasitism, both on private producers and on common property, as well as parasitic ideologies such as Marxism, libertarianism, and neoconservatism. The means of defeating them would be the implementation of proprietarian law, which will be accomplished through the completion of the scientific method, which is to say applying scientific or at least testimonial rigor to every public statement. This is a profoundly bad idea for any society which intends to survive for two simple reasons. Firstly, science is allergic to type 1 errors, false positives, and tolerant of type 2 errors, false negatives, given its strictly empirical bias, which makes science vulnerable to subversion through the type 2 error, as we know from Gould, Freud, and other scientists. However, in practice, type 1 errors usually bring small costs, whereas type 2 errors usually have gigantic costs. Mistaking a rock for a bear while on a hike is a type 1 error, while mistaking a bear for a rock is a type 2 error. I don't know if I agree with that. Why does it matter whether you mistake the bear for the rock or the rock for the bear? How is mistaking a rock for a bear a false positive, whereas mistaking a bear for a rock is a false negative? I'm not sure if I follow that metaphor. Science will claim that there's no conclusive evidence of a bear being present, assuming a rock null hypothesis, and thus carry on with the hike, while testimonialism will claim that, to the best of one's knowledge, there is no bear. Conversely, the paranoid would proceed with caution, justifying it by saying, well, if it weren't no bear cousin, but imagine if it were a bear, then you and I would get ate. This is the proper way to behave in bear country, and it's a world of bears out there. Indeed, any decision-making under conditions of uncertainty is likely to be the opposite of scientific conclusions, allergic to type 2 errors and tolerant of type 1 errors. Insofar as there are actual type 1 errors, you don't get to cry wolf for fun. We can see how science and testimonialism fare in the real world. There's still a great deal of uncertainty about aspects of our world simply because there's insufficient evidence to say anything about them. Similarly, criminals regularly escape justice because the criminal justice evidence standard, a cognate of testimonialism, is exceptionally high, chiefly due to the teleological ethical orientation of liberal justice systems, which hold that it is better to have 100 criminals at large than a single innocent man in prison. But to correct this abject absurdity, we don't need a complicated new legal system with a specially designed grammar. We only need to restore the teleological orientation of the justice system to remind it that its purpose is to suppress criminals and that a certain number of innocents jailed are an acceptable cost, given that crime is the primary internal threat to any civilized society. Moreover, suppression of crime is one of the state's primary raison d'etre, and thus one big reason why people are willing to tolerate living in the shadow of a state to begin with. As a researcher of organized crime, I feel obligated to point that Cesare Mori, the Iron Prefect of Palermo, didn't use proprietarian testimonialism to crack down on the Sicilian mafia. He used good old-fashioned mass arrests, intimidation, humiliation, house-to-house searches, and known mafia strongholds, and other strongman tactics, including winning the favor of the local population. No mean feat, given that Sicilians harbor a justified and deep resentment of the Italian state to this very day, after being given carte blanche by Mussolini to do whatever the Iron Prefect deemed necessary to clean up the mafia. Indeed, so effective was the Iron Prefect's campaign against the mafia that it took the defeat of the fascist state and the subsequent occupation for the mafia to reassert its presence. The half measures taken by Falcone, Borsellino, and others who availed themselves of the liberal justice system to suppress the mafia in the 1980s and 90s don't even come close to what was accomplished by the Iron Prefect. Indeed, the latter was in all likelihood only effective in suppressing the obviously evil and needlessly brutal Corleone gangsters, and the mafia persists in Sicily to this very day as an underground force. Falcone and Borsellino were hamstrung by the need to meticulously prove every detail. Mori could arrest on slight evidence and arrest en masse. Type 1 errors abounded in this method, but the mafia was defeated. Information as a thing. One of the examples bandied about by proprietarians of the idea's effectiveness is its prohibition of blackmail. This gives an opportunity to examine proprietarianism by contrasting it with two other systems in the realm of information commons and information protection: blackmail and intellectual property. Blackmail is the act of using one's possession of a piece of private information for extortion. Proprietarianism would declare such information to be property and deem it worthy of legal protection in a court of law, as opposed to classical libertarian approaches, which deem blackmail not to be a violation of the non-aggression principle. Libertarianism would also legalize insider trading, given that no coercion is involved in this supposed crime, whereas proprietarianism would keep it illegal, given that it constitutes a form of parasitism on private information, which can be defended as intangible property. However, strangely enough, the proprietarian legal system would crack down on the only form of intangible property our current system recognizes: intellectual property and copyright. The libertarian position on IP is crystal clear. It is impermissible, given that it relies on a government monopoly. Let us reiterate, libertarians would allow blackmail and insider trading, prohibit, or rather not enforce the law due to the ethical prohibition of aggression. Myself, acting as a reactionary lawmaker, would prohibit blackmail and insider trading while tightly controlling but still allowing the existence of IP as a means of outsourcing quasi-statal, priestly, and mercantile activities, given that the state isn't well suited to activities which do not involve force. Moreover, they would still be kept under tight control by the state. I would also retain the requirement for state-issued incorporation charters for the same reason. The proprietarian position is to prohibit blackmail and insider trading, given that they involve violations of intangible property, which I agree they do, but prohibit IP rights because they are a subsidy to entertainment concerns, which encourages pandering in the media. So there's a link to an article called End Copyright. This is confused and inconsistent position for a system which correctly identifies that there is such a thing as intangible property. However, what's missing is that the state is in practice the only entity which can mediate between tangibles and intangible property owners to reach a solution acceptable to everyone. It won't always decide fairly, but at least it will decide and not leave us in a state of indecision, wrong-headedness. There's a difference between unfair and wrong-headed, or just plain refusal to acknowledge such property as libertarianism would. I suspect what's going on here is Kurt rightfully dislikes what the various corporations are doing with IP and copyright protections, but this can be accomplished with reasserting state authority over those corporate entities, or better yet, removing their recalcitrant owners and operators, replacing them with men loyal to the state. To do this, we need to seize power. Mussolini came before Mori, but the key is to hold power and to use power as it is meant to be used, not to think up analytical systems of law which attempt to fix language and immanentize the eschaton, but leave us with glaring inconsistencies. So, yeah, I mean, my position on intellectual property is clearly there's like a 10-year window where you can make money. So you look at J.K. Rowling. She came out with Harry Potter, and within the first 10 years made a whole lot of money. She's still making money, but I think after 10 years you open that up and you say anybody can run with it. Anyone who wants to run with that ball can run with it. She's made her money. Okay, so the profit motive is there for people to write books and to create video games and to create movies in the first 10 years, because that's 90% of the profit. But after that first 10 years, you hand it over to the masses and you say, hey, you want to take the Harry Potter fan fiction stuff and make your own books and sell that to the market, you go ahead. And at that point, the property or the intellectual property ends. So that's sort of my position of clearly there's an incentive within intellectual property to spur creation, but after a certain period of time, it does the opposite. And so we just need to shorten the period of intellectual property. That would be my argument. I think it's a good compromise. But I guess I would tend to sympathize more with the Kurt Doolittle side of saying just abolish it entirely, because right now it's a ridiculous thing where you can just infinitely renew it for the last 90 years. You can just keep renewing it for another 90 years, and it's become a little bit ridiculous. You see how Bill Gates abused it to gain billions of dollars, etc., etc. Okay, we encountered some lag. I think it's back. All right, so after GLV made those arguments that I was like, oh, I'm kind of sympathetic to Kurt here, Kurt then leaves a response, and I'm going to skip most of it and just get down to the bottom, where he talks about fascism versus propertarianism, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So, as far as I know, propertarianism is about as fascist and national socialist as is possible while avoiding the problem that destroyed fascism: silly European literature and heroic nonsense, rather than the yeoman's labor of institution, economy, culture, and human capital production. In other words, I'm the best fascist I know of at the moment, and everyone else I can find is still reading fairy stories, romance novels, and fiction literature. So, I've criticized people for being fantasy novelists and treating politics erotically and treating it pornographically. I've criticized people for doing that because I think they're ignorant of what they're doing. I think they really think a civil war is around the corner, and they don't actually understand that is like a fantasy. But on the other hand, to go the extreme opposite direction, to say, like, I'm a fascist, but I've removed literature and heroism and replaced it with what I view as a communist Bolshevik concept of worshiping the yeoman's labor of institution, economy, culture, and human capital production. I mean, this is just so soulless. This is so disgusting. It's like the worst of capitalism and communism. It's just extremely materialist. And so it's, at the end of the day, I would rather have a little less institution, a little less economy, a little less culture and human capital production, and a little more literature, and a little more heroism, and a little more mythology, and a little more soul. I'd willingly make that trade, to have a little more soul, as opposed to, oh, well, we have the richest country in the world. America's great because we're so rich. We have all these institutions, economies, and human capital production. It's like, no, I'd rather live in a country of literature and heroism. That seems to be much more preferable from the position of where we're at now, in a cultural winter where we've lost a lot of our heroism, we've lost a lot of our literature, and people don't have the reason to live, not only individually but collectively. All right, so there is a part 3, and we are going to take a look at the part 3. It's pretty long, and Kurt Doolittle has his response here. Propertarianism Part 3, social control. The core problem of propertarianism is its phobia of naked power, a phobia shared by all variants of liberalism, and something that I think makes humans beings uncomfortable regardless of their ideology, unless they're actually part of the ruling class. Even then, only at a practical level, never at the conceptual. To think of power at the conceptual level is to stare down the gullet of Gnon, nature or nature's god, and Gnon is 10 times more ancient and more terrible than Cthulhu. Strangely enough, propertarianism started out as an attempt to explain the unique success of Western civilization, but unlike more successful attempts, and there's a link here to Ricardo Duquesne, it came through libertarianism and still carries a good deal of libertarian baggage, to the point that propertarianism cannot conceive of non-material means of effecting social control. Social control is effectuated through 3 means: bullying, bribing, and bamboozling. Alliterative appeal aside, you can impress or intimidate a man into obeying by his loyalty, or convince him that doing your bidding is right. A healthy regime has a mixture of all 3 methods in place to convince the men living in its shadow not to revolt with pitchforks and torches in hand. Men are given the opportunity to earn labor and wit, and even more importantly, the opportunity to marry and have children, bribery. They're convinced that obeying the king is the right and good thing to do, even ordained by their god, bamboozling, and ultimately in the event that they don't obey their king, that king and his many knights, barons, and guards would be more than happy to split their heads open with bullying. All three elements of social control are necessary, and various types of men respond to various types of social control better or worse than others. So, bamboozling, what GLV calls bamboozling, I think we could just break down into bribery and bullying. So you're selling someone, you're saying that, well, if you obey the king, you're going to go to heaven. That's a form of bribery. Or if you disobey the king, he's going to kill you. That's a form of bullying. GLV seems to be breaking down this tripartite order of social control into that which is real material bribery, that which is real material punishment, and then bamboozling being that which is immaterial and deceptive and mythological in nature. But I don't think we can break that down, and that's sort of I would critique GLV from the outset as accepting this kind of materialistic worldview that we can truly distinguish between the mere material and the metaphorical and the mythological and the linguistic. Because if I say, hey, if you do this for me, I'll give you some gold, they say, oh, that's a great bribe. Well, is gold real? What value does gold have outside of our perception of the value of gold? Really, what's important is our perception of value rather than the real value. I mean, it is a Marxist concept of the labor theory of value to say that anything has inherent value. It has the value that we give to it based on our subjective perception. If we perceive our life to be good and we enjoy living and we want to continue living, then bread has value. But if we're suicidal, then bread has no value. So value is contingent on our metaphysical, spiritual outlook and our perception. So I wouldn't distinguish between bamboozling, bribery, and bullying. I would say really there's just the positive and negative aspects they're all perceived through the mind. So I guess the realist position is like everything like the economic realism in Marxism states that like gold has real value, or a factory has real value, or a worker has real value, and the economic what's the opposite of realism? I don't even remember. Idealism. Economic idealism states that the worker has value to the extent he's imagined to have value. The factory has value to the extent it's imagined to have value. And gold has value to the extent it's imagined to have value. So I guess with respect to economics and value and social control, I'm of the idealist school rather than a realist school, if that's the correct terminology. And maybe I'm putting the wrong labels on things here, but that's kind of where I'm at. As I'm talking about this, I'm hearkening back to the debate on realism on JF versus Arvil, and my position is that like morality is as real as genetics, like almost to the extent that, I don't know, to say that morality isn't real and that it's fake is just a weird. To me, it's the same thing as saying genetics isn't real; it's fake. To me, they're both real things. They're both real things, but they're not real in the sense that they're not real in the sense that they change objects. Like, how do I break this down? So genetics is real in that genetics really is a blueprint for who we are. Like, without our genetics, we wouldn't be who we are. Morality is real in the sense that it actually does impact the trends of a society. It really does impact the character of a society, whether it's going to survive or fail given a different environment. So it's real to that extent. But then if we start talking about value, is value itself real? Value is not contained within the thing itself, but value is contained within the mind of the perceiver who is perceiving the value. Now, to what extent does that contradict my position on moral realism, that morality is just as real as genetics? And maybe I'm using the terms reality, and my definition of what is real and what is not real is confused here. But I'm trying to untangle this and come to a consistent position or reconcile these two things, that morality is real in the mind of the agent in the same way that genetics is real in the body of the organism. And if the mind is destroyed, then morality ceases. And if the body is destroyed, then that genetic code disperses and disappears. So I guess my argument is not that morality doesn't exist out there in the ether, but morality becomes real when agents actually exist in an environment. Then morality is that set of behaviors which allow them to succeed in that environment. And in the same way, genetics does not exist out in the ether, but genetics is something that exists in a body of a biological organism, which allows it to construct itself and to reproduce within a given environment. So it's real in the sense that it's instantiated in reality, and we can observe it, and we can empirically catalog it and compare one set to another set, and it's real, and that it's not just arbitrary, but it's constructed with respect to a real environment, an environment that has conditions. But environments change, and perceptions change, and genetics change, and morality changes, and that changes the value of individual objects. So I don't look at any given object and say that this object has real value. Its value is contingent upon the agent and the environment and the context of that object. So I don't know if that makes sense. That's the system I'm going with for the moment. I think there is a little bit of confusion in the terms real, imaginary, ideal, whatever, that maybe we need to have subterms that distinguish between different cases. Let's get back to the article. Different methods of social control are necessary. A sociopathic brigand fears the noose while paying little heed to faith or opportunity. A religious fanatic fears God. The salt of the earth worker takes threats of violence as a sign of disrespect and has no time for superstitions, but will go to earn his daily bread. All of us fall into these three continuums, with maximum or minimum responsivity to violence, conviction, and bribery. Proprietarianism completely disregards conviction as a mode of social control, or doesn't accept that convincing necessarily involves bamboozling and deception, even in the public interest. I'm going to sneeze. Sneeze is passed, and we're back to the article. All right, proprietarianism doesn't recognize this. The Church of Proprietarianism will tell the truth to the best of its knowledge. This will usually not involve claiming that it is good and proper that our people survive, even at the expense of the survival of other people, because it cannot risk making that false positive type 1 error. Proprietarian's libertarian heritage makes it cagey about naked power, so it puts its faith in the rule of law, and Kurt Doolittle's belief he can devise a system of law which is free of error and potential for abuse, not understanding that it is possible for the state to abdicate any portion of its powers without falling into private hands, where the lack of formal recognition of state function allows abuses unparalleled by any absolute or feudal ruler. Failure to recognize the inevitability of cartelization and the quasi-statal nature of some industries is what has led today's distorted marketplace, what the mid-century fascists and third positionists were trying to rectify. It is also abundantly clear to medieval man who devised a system of guilds and charters to formalize these inevitable relations between the government and economy, lest the government and large corporations be bound to an informal and destructive manner. Proprietarianism, however, seems to rely entirely on the promise of material stability and pursuing parasites for fun and profit that we've already established will generate a culture of nosy busybodies. How will you control men when you recoil from faith and fear power? American Nightmares. A final issue with proprietarianism is what we call a coup complete solution, which is to say that in order to implement proprietarianism, a group would have to fully seize power in the West. For this reason alone, because it presupposes power, it is appealing. A secure, powerful government is always better than an insecure, impotent government, such as we have now. Thus, the proprietarian armies would have to defeat the left in armed conflict first. I passed over some of the issues with that in the beginning, but let us take a deeper look into the question of armed conflict. Firstly, the victory of the right is not a foregone conclusion in a hypothetical war between the left and the right in the United States. People who say the right has all the guns are forgetting that the left has many state allies abroad who can furnish it with weaponry. As in the first American Civil War, foreign powers will fund, arm, and train the various factions. The distributist in the video linked to previously points out that nothing stops China from sailing a ship full of AK-47s into San Francisco Harbor and arming the Antifa to counter the redneck militias. There's also the fact that the United States harbors millions of ethnic Mexicans who themselves represent a faction in such a war and would probably be supported by the Mexican government, and Mexico will likely retain sovereign integrity for longer than the United States. Indeed, a coalition of Chinese-backed leftists and Mexican-backed guerrillas is likely to defeat any rightist coalition that arises, a coalition that isn't very likely to attract support from abroad. I guess the counter-argument would be that China would be willing to support the right wing because it would know the right wing would lose, and therefore China would support the losing faction because it would want to sustain a civil war in America to weaken the power of America. That's one argument. The other argument is that China is dependent upon the American economy to survive and would want to see the restoration of the American economy and end the Civil War as quickly as possible, and therefore would fuel the left because the left would be likely to win. One of the arguments that Republicans make in terms of Civil War projections, and they say the right-wing people have all the guns and right-wing people have all the food. That's not true. Food production in America is controlled by mega-million corporations like Monsanto, and food production would be monopolized by the left and not the right wing. There are still small farms in America, but they're dwindling very, very quickly. Most farmland in America is not small farms owned by rednecks. Most farmland in America is owned by mega-million leftist corporations. Additionally, a lot of the small farmers are left-wing anarchists, communes, anti-white hippies with dreadlocks, so on and so forth. So that itself, I mean, the food argument is a powerful argument Republicans use, but they're totally wrong about it. The big farms in America are some of the biggest supporters of mass immigration. So this is just a totally wrong-headed idea on the part of the right in America. Let's continue reading the article, though. Of note is also the fact that white and right-leaning Americans generally lack a friend-enemy distinction, such as leftists and Mexicans possess. As such, they cannot effectively organize beyond the local level. This may be enough in the pocket Bosnia scenario, likely to characterize the earlier days of such a civil war, but it will prove impotent against concentrated action by state actors, especially if those state actors pool their effort in order to defeat a rightist coalition. We have to remember the Soviet Union in its early days, the right wing was monarchists, and they were also constitutional monarchists, and they were also Ukrainian nationalists, and they were also all sorts of ethnic nationalists, and they were also like random Germans running around. So you had all these factions, but they weren't able to consolidate and fly under one flag and one banner, whereas the left was able to consolidate very well. Here's a nightmare scenario. Social control breaks down in the United States and Canada, leading to a pocket Bosnia scenario. Every unsettled account is settled violently. Every seed of resentment blooms into murder. The cities are jungles of war, of all against all, and warfare is primarily waged on the personal and familial level. Rural America survives, as do enclaves in the cities where there's enough cohesion that fear of the police isn't the only thing holding back the beast of primal man. These places become havens of peace and prosperity, and then become easy pickings for quasi-state actors backed by three foreign powers, namely China, Mexico, and the European Union, aided by Israel. The three foreign powers and their quislings declare occupation zones and start administering the North American continent in accordance with the leftist ideology of their choice. Those hoping for Russian assistance are hoping in vain. Russians know their limitations, are aware that at this point of the time, the best they can do is survive and keep their powder dry, that they won't be an imperial power capable of projecting over vast distances for at least another 50 years. They won't get involved in an American Civil War. Sounds scary. It's far likelier than heroic Minutemen restoring the Republic, and even that is downright realistic compared to Proletarian Minutemen. If the right, essentially right-leaning white people have a future on the North American continent, is by acting in decentralized groups animated by a common purpose and high asabiya, a togetherness which gives the men cause to sacrifice for the common good. The common purpose asabiya, the culture of decentralization, is what allows the Taliban to run circles around the bureaucratic blundering beast, which is the United States military in Afghanistan. It is true that guerrillas can disrupt weak empires, but only if they have the aforementioned unity of purpose and an ally in power, either within the empire or a foreign state, or barring such an ally, are facing a regime so weak that it cannot control its territory. Propertarianism tellingly doesn't provide such a unity of purpose due to the social control issues discussed above, but also due to its lack of historical context. The American empire found its common purpose in the liberal ideology, but this was only possible because liberal ideology was itself piggybacking on the Anglo genotype and Anglophone nations of the world. To be an Anglo usually meant being liberal in one way or another during the period which saw the rise of the British and American empires. Even though the British and American empires were liberal empires, however, it is important to keep in mind that liberalism had a symbiosis with Englishness, which only ended in the wake of the Second World War when it defeated fascism. It was taken from the Anglos, spread across the West after the fall of the Soviet Union. It diluted, found itself to be property of the world, has that for intangible commons, with a few recalcitrant holdouts such as North Korea, Iran, and Cuba. Propertarianism lacks liberalism's historical lineage. Even though it claims descent from liberalism, it will for that reason not glom onto any particular nation or genetic line, and not serve as the official religion or ideology of any tribe. Contrast that with the Preußentum-style corporate state which resonates with Germans, or even Moldbugian neo-reaction, a Carlylean restorationist creed updated for the modern world, which is the alternative ideology of the Anglo world kept alive in bits and pieces throughout the Puritan liberal night. Propertarianism has most in common with a truncated form of old-style Puritan liberalism, but the genetic line likely to carry this ideology, the Danish-descended Anglos of Essex and Lincoln via New England, are firstly engrossed with classical liberalism, and secondly are dying due to classical liberalism. Maybe I've stumbled upon a possible niche for the propertarian idea, though. It has its flaws, but it can serve to organize Yankees into something that passes for right-wing thought. It's certainly a better option than liberalism for a people that has proven itself consistently unable to bear right-wing regimes. The people highly unlikely to adopt propertarianism, however, are fighting age fit for battle males of America who are overwhelmingly Christian and lack faith in written constitutions, rule of law, and completions of the scientific method. Rather, what these men crave is a leader who will take their energy and channel it into greatness, a leader who will give them a chance to live like lions, conquer, and make survival possible for themselves and their families. They crave such a leader because their bodies are very much aware that history is driven by great men, not great ideologies, that ideologies and religions are tools in the hands of great men who seize power by means of their indomitable will. In my nightmare scenario above, such a great man at the head of a tribe, whether synthetic or real, makes the territories of North America ungovernable to the three occupying powers through guerrilla actions, forcing them to retreat in whatever schedule and proportion, or merely lasting long enough until the fall of the American empire leads to a global reckoning, as all the untenable relations held in place by the fear of the American military might are dissolved and renegotiated, often in bloody conflicts. This forces the three occupying powers to retreat to their homelands. Either scenario returns the situation to a Bosnia classic, ethnic enclaves embroiled in low-intensity community-level conflict, which allowed this charismatic leader's group to conquer much of the continent due to superior asabiya. After that is complete, the group will have very little use for propertarianism, though some of its useful ideas might be utilized in its new paradigm. Conclusions. There's a lot to process about propertarianism, but precious little to go on. The lack of a single text where the propertarian idea is defined so that it may be critiqued is a big issue. In this article, I've taken pronouncements by Kurt Doolittle to be representative of propertarian ideology, where I found such to be lacking in the Propertarian Institute's website. Perhaps these concerns will be addressed in the future. However, from what information we have, I conclude that propertarianism very naively believes it can sidestep human nature, eliminate leftism, which is to say eliminate sin, solve the problems of liberalism using liberal methods, and come to power with relative ease. It is blind to the problems of liberalism as indicated by the neo-reactionary Dark Enlightenment sphere or the traditionalist philosophers before that. It dismisses attacks on the Enlightenment for being Germanic or Semitic, though it is the Enlightenment and its philosophies that cause many of modernity's problems. It dismisses moral objections as moralizing. For example, I'm likely to get attacked for moralizing for pointing out the severe risk of busybodies would propose under propertarian law. Ultimately, propertarianism isn't even all that concerned with the problems of white survival. Sure, parasitism and deceptions are problems, but we can tolerate some deception and some parasitism insofar as we can survive. Survival is the chief issue facing us here. This is a problem of birth rates, of territorial defense, of replacing the ruling regime with one amenable to our survival, with the awakening of the European warrior, and with many other things that have little to do with the letter of the law. It's important not to lose sight of that. Propertarianism offers no solutions for white survival outside of civil war, and even that is orthogonal to the philosophy itself. To be fair, I don't have any non-military solutions to offer either, but at least I'm not asking you to learn a complicated new way of thinking. Just lift weights, learn martial arts, obtain weapons training, become embedded in your community skills, which will be useful in any case. The mere fact you see Russia as some kind of savior is really telling how the alt-right is a total joke. So that's a stupid comment. That's not at all what GLV says. If I was a Kurt response, he says, if I was writing fiction, opinion, essay, rational reality, or rational philosophy, I could rush it. I cannot rush it. I get one shot to make myself the answer to Marx and Kant. Everyone's going to try to take care of it. Everyone is jealous and preserving their little fantasies and lies. I'm the natural aristocracy. Cheers. Phobia of naked power. Here's Kurt Doolittle's other response. All psychologism, which is not a word, all psychologism is a derivative of Abrahamism, demonstrating my point. Either my argument standard or not. You would need to produce some evidence that the fascist or naked power has exceeded in anything other than the death of millions of their own, utter failure. For the same reason armchair political and armchair generals dream of success, while those with political and military power always and everywhere start with strategy, exploitable weakness, and logistics, mundane job of moving resources. I'm not phobic of much of anything, even if I have a hypersensitivity to disgust of proximity to undomesticated human animals, so to speak. Instead, having spent my life on these subjects, I have come to understand that it is wealth in one thing or another, bodies, food, tech, resources, territory, that produces competitive ability to hold and maintain power. Then the West, a small number of people on the edge of the Bronze Age with distributed means of production, making concentration of power and taxation impossible, used expensive technological advantage, maneuver in the most dynamic social and political order in the world to defeat vastly superior enemies, except when they were overwhelmed by peasant immigration or attempted rule of vast numbers due to territorial overextension. So I am an engineer, not a fantasy or literature fan, which describes the fascists. The fact that we need the ability, as did the Romans, to ascend a dictator in times of war, as we do now, and then restore aristocratic rule when the crisis is past, is another way of saying governments must adapt to suit the circumstance, not the ideal. So yeah, Kurt Doolittle is an engineer, not a leader, not a philosopher, not anything. He's an engineer. The lowest, which, in the Hindu caste system is the lowest. You have the priests at the top, and then the warriors, and then you have the workers. And Kurt Doolittle is a worker. He is an engineer. He's concerned with economics. He's not concerned with ideas. He is not concerned with even morality or any. He's just concerned with doing his work, doing his engineering, making his little train set go around and round and round. Kurt says he agrees with Ricardo Duquesne. He agrees with Kevin MacDonald, traditional philosophers, German literary thinkers, secular theology, blah, blah, blah. Honest, can't fault you. Winky face. Anglo-constitutional system is the longest living in the world. I don't know how you measure that. I mean, Germanic law goes back pretty far. Roman law goes back pretty far. Hammurabi's code is pretty old. So I don't know where you get the idea that the Anglo-constitutional system is the longest living in the world. GLV responds. He says, naked power is like a naked singularity. God abhors it. Everyone abhors it, but it gets stuff done. Fascists were defeated by an Anglo-Soviet coalition. It's true, because the fascists were afraid of naked power, whereas the Anglos and especially Soviets availed themselves of pure power, even if they drove themselves into moralistic paroxysms after the war. Projecting much of the use of naked power onto the defeated Germans and Japanese will have to go through far more suffering if we're to resign ourselves to the necessity of power. Also, insourcing logistics to the military is a relatively new phenomenon, began by Martinet under Napoleon, has mixed success. To be charitable, governments are usually bad at doing things that aren't pure force. Literature and religion generate asabiya. Without asabiya, we're dead. If they fail to synthesize it, it's because they fought Christianity without realizing their enemy was liberalism. Also, late 19th century Germanic romantics were already in the midst of a decaying culture. Bits and pieces of my plan are scattered around countercurrents. We accept the cyclical nature of history, ride the tiger to completion, establishing an organic society in the aftermath focused on biological survival and human-sized living. Trying to develop a commensurate language for all thought will probably drive you insane, Kurt. Trying to stare down the gullet of Gnon and ride out the chaos, and even if you make it out alive, the chaos of the human psyche will break your system into 1,000 little fragilities. You call it psychologizing, but you're trying to circumscribe a thing which is infinite. He responds, sorry, I mistook you for a serious person. And then someone responds, and I think that's all the parts of the GLV. We've got some we've got some interesting stuff on some Ann Coulter. We've got Avengers Endgame going on, which I haven't seen yet. And then we've got some Laurie Torian, who probably looks Finnish. His name sounds Finnish to me. Was a Finnish soldier. Yep. Indeed, I could tell that he was Finnish. And then you've got some writings here, Zarathustra. I'm just reading stuff, I'm just closing out all the tabs. It's been a wild ride reading about proprietarianism. Here's the thing, guys, here's the thing. There are millions of people in the world, and most people are apathetic, and most people are not doing anything. And the people who talk, who are most serious, like, you've got GLV, you've got Kurt Doolittle, you got these people, and they're, like, super serious, and they're like, we're fighting for the salvation of Western civilization. They're so super serious. And then it's like, okay, what are you doing? What have you done? And then they're like, there's not a whole lot. Like, they talk, and they use words, and not a lot is actually going on. So you just think about the apathy of people, and you think about the non-action going on, the fact that nothing is happening. And there is a kind of untapped potential. If you had some form of fanaticism, if you had some kind of martyrdom similar to the early Christians, or to, I don't think Islamic fanaticism is all that it's made out to be. But even that is less decaying and is less dead than what we have right now. It's a little less apathetic. I still think there's a huge problem of apathy in the Islamic community. I still think that the Islamic community is apathetic to a great degree, that people don't actually realize until you actually investigate the Islamic community, the extent to which Islam has been a sick man, of Europe since its defeat at the gates of Vienna. That Islam is a sick and a dying religion in a lot of ways, that it's secularized in a lot of ways, that it's very vulnerable and it's very fragile, and it's kept in place by brutal violence and dictatorship, and it's not really, the religion itself is not giving people the spirit to proselytize and to advance themselves, but that Saudi Arabia is a fragile regime held up by Israel and America. Saudi Arabia, if it's not held up by oil money in Israel and America, it's going to collapse into being another Afghanistan. Afghanistan is an irrelevant, backwards, third world country that is going to be exploited by China. So I don't see any power or vitality in the Muslim world. Relative to the West, it seems to be powerful and full of vital energies. I don't think it actually does have those powerful vital energies. I think that's inaccurate, and most people don't understand that. But I think it's true. And so the question is, we're coming to this point where white male suicide is increasing. And you kind of have to ask, like, what's next? Do we just continue sliding down this path of self-erasure? Or is there some kind of point at which people say, hey, rather than kill ourselves, we could do something different. There is a different path. There is a choice that we could make. It's a little bit different from what we're doing. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if that's some kind of practical political solution. I don't know if that's some kind of spiritual, religious, type of creation of a new Buddhism. Buddhism didn't exist before Buddha. He had to come and create it. Of course, it's related to Hindu concepts and earlier perennial concepts, but he had to come and instantiate Buddhism, and it swept Asia. I mean, Buddhism swept over China, and it swept over Japan, and it swept over these countries. So there was an explosive potential when Buddha came along, and he created Buddhism. I mean, that had an explosive potential at that point in history. So the question is, what is the next explosive potential? What is the next explosive religion? What direction is it going to take? I mean, Buddhism in itself is very inward looking, and it doesn't really care about world empire. It doesn't really care about solving the problems of the world. In fact, it cares about escaping the world through spiritualism. On the other hand, something like Islam or Christianity does have it did turn out to have a lot of political repercussions. Islam being even more political than Christianity, of turning toward the world and seeing how do we solve the problems of the world. So whereas Buddhism is fairly tolerant toward other religions, Christianity and Islam are fairly intolerant. So it's a question, are we going to have an explosion of religion that is intolerant and is politically domineering, or is it going to be like Buddhism, where it is turning away from the world and ascending, and is such a thing possible? I mean, certainly the potential is there. Is it actually something that can happen? Because people have turned so far toward materialism and investment in economic language, as you see from people like Kurt Doolittle. It's hard to imagine that we can just escape that and gain some kind of faith again. It's hard to imagine. And so we can philosophize about it, and we can try to break down this. Again, it's a pre-rational thing. Like, your will to live and your love of the world or your hate of the world, in the sense that Schopenhauer talked about hating the world and rejecting the world and being Gnostic, these things are pre-rational. These things are pre-rational. They have to do with the will. And as much as we try to dissect their instantiations and different philosophies and relate them back to this or that, and try to think of how we could create something new, you can never create faith through reason. You can never create fanaticism through logos, through language. You have to go before language, prior to language. You have to hit at something primal that still exists, not just in humanity, but exists in technology. Like, technology wants to grow. It has this will of its own. It wants to grow, it wants to evolve, and we're coming to the point where it's going to separate from humanity, and as Alex Jones says, there's going to be a break-off civilization. There's going to be a new civilization led by human-animal hybrids or androids or cyborgs or something. Something's coming next. We don't know what that is, but that thing will have a will to live. It will have this basic will that precedes rationality that we're losing. It's almost like our life force is being drained from us and given to this new technological super species that's going to come after us. Seems like the process that's happening. So how do you be fanatical about your own death? We've been dying. I mean, Neanderthals have been dying for 40,000 years. So how do you be happy about your own dying? How do you be happy about something's coming after you? I guess at that point you have to have faith in reincarnation. You have to believe that your soul is going to be reincarnated in a super cyborg human-animal hybrid or something in the future, and that your will and your power and your soul is going to be instantiated in some future or alternative reality, and you're going to, reflect upon the nature of beauty in a Pythagorean sense in the universe. When you order the cosmos, the world order, and you create beauty in reflection with divinity, and you're able to meditate upon divinity and divine forms. I guess that is ultimately, I don't know, I think that's the only way you can go if you truly recognize the situation that Neanderthals have been dying for 40,000 years, and we're reaching some kind of endpoint here where something new is coming. You can't. I mean, if your mindset is limited to humanity, and specifically it's like it limited to whiteness, and that's it, then you can't look at the future. Like you cannot. You have to start denying the evidence of what the future is, because it conflicts with your axiomatic preference for you as yourself in this moment. So really the only way, you either have to become a denialist of the future, or you have to become suicidal and depressed. I don't think either of those are good options. So I think you have to transcend this particular instantiation. I mean, in order to live, in order to fight, in order to be an agent, you have to believe in something beyond yourself. You can't, because otherwise you're either depressed or you're in denial. And maybe the according to the materialist perspective, I guess reincarnation is just another form of denial. But at least it's not a form of denial that leads us to make false predictions about the future. I mean, like when I get people talk to me about defeating Luciferian transhumanism, I'm like, well, this is not something that can be defeated. I'm certain if you talk to dinosaurs, the dinosaurs refer to mammals as Luciferian Trans-Dinosaurs. That might be the title of the video. I'm sorry, it has nothing to do with 90%, 99% of what I've talked about here, but that is such a good term, I'm going to have to use it. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.